Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being with us. I'm going to give Cody's Pope is letting everybody into the webinar, so we're going to give just a couple more minutes as I watch the attendance increase, and we'll get started in just a minute or so. Thank you. Good evening and welcome to our third virtual event in our speaker series, Reform, Restoration, Revitalization, and Representation, with this one titled Dismantling Systemic Racism Through Education and Workforce Development Reform. I'm Molly Lamb. I'm the Executive Director of the Center of State Policy and Leadership at the University of Illinois Springfield. And together this evening with Tiffany Hightower, the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus Foundation Executive Director, and Dean Smith, the Dean of the College of Public Affairs and Administration, we are so excited to have Senate Majority Leader Kimberly A. Lightford back with us this evening, and joined by Representative Carol Ammons. Senator Lightford and Representative Ammons champion Pillar 2, or the Education and Workforce Development pillar of the reform package. This pillar this evening and of what we'll be discussing seeks to improve early education learning through adult learning. Tonight's session will bring to you increased awareness about the intentions of Pillar 2, what's involved, and what it sets out to accomplish. We're equally enthusiastic to be joined by an esteemed panel who will be delivering an overview of the rationale and importance of connecting education to workforce development, along with articulating clear ways synergies are created at all levels of education to develop a stronger workforce. In their roles, they'll reveal projects and ways which implementation is occurring and advancements are being made. We are pleased to be joined by Dr. Sophia Gelhausen, who is the Senior Associate Director for Policy at the Illinois Board of Higher Education, Dr. Tiffany Brunson, who's the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Rockford Public Schools, Dr. Betsy Goulet, who's a clinical assistant professor at UIS in Public Administration and a joint faculty member of the Center of State Policy and Leadership, Dr. Nicole Nash Moody, Assistant Superintendent of Teaching, Learning, and School Culture at the Springfield Public Schools, Amawali Kassel, Director of Pritzker Tech Talent Labs at the Discovery Partners Institute, Ken Walker, the Executive Vice President of Diversity and Operational Excellence for Perscolas, Dr. Stacy Davis Gates, Political Director of Chicago's Teachers Union, and Ryan Williams, our online program coordinator, Master of Arts in Education at UIS, and a Doctor of Public Administration student at UIS, who's going to be serving as our moderator for the panel. For more information and background about our esteemed panelists and our Senator Lightford and Representative Ammons, you can go to the announcements to read more about their backgrounds and biographies. Just a bit of housekeeping before I pass the baton on to Tiffany. Chat has been disabled, and we really encourage interactive interaction amongst the audience and hope that you'll submit Q&A using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now I hand off to Tiffany to moderate the fireside chat and give an overview more formally of our session this evening. Thank you again for being with us. Tiffany, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Molly. Once again, we are so enthusiastic about this partnership between UIS and the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus Foundation. As we discussed in our first installment, this omnibus package to end systemic racism that the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus ushered forward was amazing. And as we dove into Pillar 1 with the incredible senators and representatives there, we will do the same thing here for Pillar 2, which is education and workforce development. And before going into the fireside chat, just an overarching kind of discussion about it is that the goal to dismantle systemic racism within the Illinois educational system with early childhood through adult learning by expanding access to early childhood intervention services, creating a uniform kindergarten readiness assessment, matching high school graduation requirements with basic university core requirements, creating commissions to address how schools teach the history of marginalized groups and address students who have experienced trauma, expanding access to teacher preparation programs for marginalized groups, supporting IBHE's efforts to fund higher education more equitably, and more. And even more so for this specific series, we're going to talk about how important it is to understand how education feeds directly into workforce development and understanding the various career pathways that are available for our students, for our Black students throughout the state of Illinois. And so without further ado, I'd love to introduce this wonderful fireside chat with the wonderful and phenomenal Majority Leader, Senator Kimberly A. Lightford, and the equally as awesome and fantastic Representative Carol Ammons, who, when we started this whole project, which is so intriguing, like if you go back to the beginning of it, it was Senator Lightford and Representative Ammons that I sat down with when we were developing the whole retreat series that launched this whole thing. And so kind of when we get into pillar 2, I want to throw it back to you all real quick. How do you feel about, one, this work that you all did around education and workforce development and its overall impact, and kind of the feeling when that part of the omnibus package passed?
Hi, good evening. I'm Senator Lightford, and I'm happy to be joined with Carol Ammons, State Representative, my co-chair. We are a partner, we're a team in this effort. Tiffany, I think the major thing for me is I feel that after serving for 22 years on the Senate Education Committee, that many of these items are items that I've been trying to dismantle for a very long time. And I feel some relief in that we are finally addressing many of these inequities and disparities that are in our curriculum and in our practices that creates racial division. And it doesn't support the most vulnerable children and young adults who need the assistance. So I feel a little relief in that after 22 years, I have a package that I could present to say, you know, there has been a lot of systemic racism, a lot of bills that never were voted on or never got past the legislature, that never, or actually passed the legislature that was never implemented. And, you know, it helps me to know that after 2 generations of students have gone through a system that is set up for failure for them, that I finally found a way to enact some changes so that future generations will be able to receive better supports from our school system.
And I think I'll just jump right in after Leader Lightford.
Absolutely.
First of all, thank you so much, Executive Director Tiffany Hightower, and to UIS for even putting this series together. So it's always a pleasure for me to talk to educators and interested stakeholders around issues pertaining to education and access. Leader Lightford just really made the point kind of crystal that not only has she been working on this issue for over 20 years, but honestly, people weren't listening for all the years that she was working on this issue. Prior to my joining the General Assembly, she had already identified many of these as barriers to education. So I wanted to certainly highlight for a person like Leader Lightford, who's been working on this for over 2 decades, her commitment and her steadfastness to stay at it, even though people may not have heard or listened or even saw it as a valuable proposition to invest in. So this is a really exciting time, I think, for everyone to really acknowledge it's not a pointing the finger kind of moment. It's the moment where we identify the barriers that maybe had been identified in the past, but not acted upon in a way that we needed to do policy-wise to make the outcomes different. And I'm happy that she is still here to pass on her experience to me as a new member, only been in the General Assembly for 7 years, learning some of the barriers that I know and I see every day, but sometimes I can't put the right word to it, or I can't put the right policy on it to make the change. I also want to add that there are some basic things that are strategies that have come out of the community for a long time. The grandmother who said, something is wrong, my child is not learning, and she may herself may not have the educational words to describe what's happening to her grandson, right, or to her own son. But we as educators, policymakers, and activists who see and know what the barriers are have to have the courage to address those barriers and to change them. And some people may not see it as a value proposition to help Black students. But I assure you that when we worked on the pillars collectively, and you tie those pillars together, whether you're talking about criminal justice reform, that is tied to education or the lack thereof, right? Or if you're talking about healthcare and human services or the lack thereof, COVID has revealed that that too is tied to access to education resources and learning how to advocate for yourself and your community. So we have all of these pieces that are tied together economically, educationally, healthcare, criminal justice. These are all tied together by one string. And unfortunately, that string is systemic racism when it comes to the Black and brown communities. And so we have to uproot them, even if it makes people uncomfortable. And I think that that's what we're here to do. So thank you for allowing me to chat here in this fireside and to join the panel this evening.
Well, absolutely. So speaking of, you brought up some good points, both Leader Lightford and Representative Ammons. The issue there about making people uncomfortable, right? Like, I think if we're going to talk about it and talk about it in a serious way, education is the foundation of everything, to both of you all's point. Like, it doesn't matter what you're trying to do, which direction you're trying to go in life, you have to learn about it before you can take those critical steps, right? I got two questions, I think. One, what was the most surprising barrier in trying to kind of pass this legislation, like the most surprising opposition that you received where it pertains to getting equity for Black students, right? And what was the most intriguing win at the end of the day? So the strongest barrier that you were like, really, this is what we're going to argue about? And then what was the biggest win?
Carrie, you want me to start first? Because I probably see things a little differently.
You can start first, Leader.
Okay, because after so many years, I didn't see a barrier. You know, I was focused. I knew what we needed as a community. I was driven by the George Floyd incident to do more, not incident, but murder, but to do more than just protests. I saw a clear opportunity to hold my colleagues accountable. My colleagues who are not African-American, who do not live the African-American experience. And once I learned the data, I mean, you know, there's always been data and the data is truthful, but when I saw the numbers never changing and you go one decade after another decade and the same problems exist, that means no one's really trying to improve outcomes for Black students. And so it's always just the conversation, but there's really nothing to put forth to make sure that those systemic changes happen. And when I saw that 48% of Americans today are born into poverty, 48% are born into poverty, and 46% live within poverty. So that's just a 2% ratio of Blacks that make it out of poverty. And education is the stem, it's the root, it's the foundation. And that's why it was important for us to start with preschool. We have to start, and when we took a look at this, I wanted to make sure we address this from preschool through higher education and workforce, because we've done a good job in the state over the last, say, 10 years, 15 years after we created the P20 Council, to make sure that we were driving our students to attain a higher education. But what did we do for those students who says, I can't go to college for whatever reason? I don't want to go, I can't go, no one else in my family has been there, I don't know if this is for me. What did we set up for them to ensure in the workforce development space that they could still have a career, a sustaining life, be able to give them successful skills to be able to take with them? That's why our unemployment rate is the highest amongst African-American men. They're not being taught starting as early as preschool, and then they're being pushed through a system by the third grade that says they're failing. And then it's like, well, push them on out, give them a GED, or they drop out completely. And then there's no other recourse. There's no other opportunity. And that's why it was so important to make sure that we started from preschool and addressed issues all the way through to workforce development. So I didn't see barriers. I was determined we were going to get this done. And all of our colleagues who were chanting, enough is enough, they were, saying to me in private, Kimberly, we ought to do something about these social disparities and all these inequities. And I wanted to open this up so that it wasn't a process that was done where there was no transparency. And so we had hearings. In fact, we had 7 public hearings over 2.5 hours for each particular hearing. So we spent over 20 hours in public setting with researchers and professionals, and actually those who are doing the work. We actually had them testify to say, what are some of those barriers that keep you from ensuring that all students are successful, that all students are given a wonderful quality education? And from there, we were able to take that data and that information and learn it as with all of our colleagues who serve on the education committees in both chambers, let them hear what we're hearing all at the same time, so we can all kind of learn and grow together. There's this myth that legislators know everything, know it all, know every subject, and it's not true. So we wanted to start with members on the education committees in both chambers and let them ask those questions to those education stakeholders, to those who've been involved in the education realm, to find out why the data exists and why it has continued to show all of these academic achievement gaps and every other gap that exists amongst African-American students. The win was the bill itself. The win was getting our colleagues to understand and accept the systemic racism and actually put their vote to it to say that we want change. So the win was the change that was realized amongst colleagues that doesn't look like me and that doesn't have the same experience. And the win was also in working with Representative Ammons in identifying those things that go beyond finances. It's always, you don't need any more money in education, or, we just created the education funding base model, so education doesn't need anything else. And I thought, really? Are you kidding me? And so that was the driver for me, and that was the win, just to prove to them that these problems have existed a very long time. And I'll just say now for the record that this is just a start. This is just a start. There has to be implementation, follow through, and then the continuation. There's so much systemic racism embedded in how we teach our children that this was just a wonderful start.
I am certainly, I'm so happy that the leader said that this is just a start, because I've been working this week on the expansion of our pillars for that reason. I'll just add to what she just shared. for a lot of folks who are educators and researchers on this call, we've done a lot of work researching all the problems that we see in the educational space. Often we don't want to name it though. We don't want to just drill down to why is it that Black students are not succeeding in the educational space? Well, we have a few things that we learned through these hearings that were barriers to their success, right? Not barriers to us and our ability to change it, but really barriers to their success. Like, consistently putting Black students, largely Black students, into remedial coursework. In many cases, because colleges, in this case, community colleges, don't allow the person to utilize their last best placement in high school to go on to the next course, they have this little thing called, now we got to test you again when you get to the community college level. So if I was in algebra 2 when I left high school, or calculus when I left high school, if I passed that class, I should be in the next best placement. I may not do well on your testing methods, right? And we've already identified that there are so many biases in the test, but we haven't changed it at all because colleges get payments from these testing companies to offer these tests. And so we have to remove that because we already know that it's not a good measurement of the ability of a student to do well at the next level in college. We saw 77% of Black students going into math remedial and 67% going into English remedial, as if they're the only students that might need support. That is not true. And that is the crux of we saw that systemic racism coming in, because they were automatically tested into that 2-year college, even though they may have passed the last best math course or English course in high school. That's a barrier. We saw that. And we said, no, we're going to change that because A, they are losing too much money on paying for remedial coursework that does not go towards their college graduation. First of all, most students will drop out before you get there because we're going to exhaust their financial aid. And so that's a little insidiousness that we saw through our subject matter hearings. We saw many things like that from the pre-K all the way to the workforce development that manifest themselves in racialized outcomes, right? So our goal was to really get at the fact that this was a racialized practice and to get rid of it. So that was one of the things that I thought was eye-opening for me, and I can go all the way to pre-K and show you where it exists there, all the way up to workforce development, where in some places, everyone is not going to go to our great 4-year institutions. We know that. But the reality is we've not prepared students in any other way except that you got to go to a 4-year or you're going to be working on the line at a service industry job that has no career advantage, right? So we wanted to remove that. And we wanted to also address the workforce development piece on the other end of the spectrum that had people going to 13 different agencies to try to figure out workforce development in the state of Illinois. And so we just had so many pieces that we needed to look at, I think, as we delve into the project and worked with our partners on this. All of those things manifested disparities, every single one of them, from pre-K all the way to workforce development. And lastly, I'll say the win. I agree with Leader Lightford that the win was the bill. But honestly, I think the win is going to be where the system deliverers, the educators that teach teachers, when they buy in and remove the curriculum that makes teachers think some people are worthy of their time and others are not, where we know we have systems that don't allow us to effectively recruit Black and Brown teachers to be in the classroom and to create a culture where they have a real opportunity for advancement in their own careers, we are then doing the work, and the win comes, I believe, there. And I can go through many wins as I see it, but the bill is only one way to get us to address our deep embedded biases and to deal with the fact that all of us work in a system that is based on these premises that some people deserve and some others may not, even if we don't speak to it honestly. I think that that's part of the win that Leader Lightford and I will continue to work on in the continuation of following our legislation now, but also what we will introduce in the coming days that we do see as a result of the work that we've done through this particular pillar.
So first of all, thank you so much for those comments. I do want to I want to kind of go to workforce development a little bit and spend a little moment there, because I've been saying for a minute, we used to have vocational education in high school. I think the same way they dismiss voc ed is the same way they dismiss the arts and music, right? And I say that African and Black children learn, there are 7 paths of learning based upon an African system. Like they learn through art, they learn through music. It's like 7 core competencies. But we got rid of those, and then it was this whole pivot to 4-year institutions. You got to go to a 4-year institution. You got to go to a 2-year institution. Now, you all both know me very well. You know I'm a big time nerd, and I will spend my lifetime in school if I could, because that's what I like. But I also have an 11-year-old godson, and he's like, TT, I do not want to go to anybody's college. I want to work on cars. I want to be a mechanic. And I said, you know what, baby, that's okay. You know why? Because there is a career pathway for you there too. My fear though, when we get to the workforce development space, and then maybe this is where you can all talk about some of the gains that you all made in terms of looking at trades, the unions, apprenticeship, like all of those things where it was a workforce pathway as well, that might not indicate that you have to get a 2-year or 4-year degree, but might indicate you can go to this space after your GED and actually learn a career. Like when you all thought about, because that's actually how you eradicate the generational wealth gap, is give people multiple opportunities to take care of their families in a sustainable way, right? With true finance, true economic equity. So when you look at that, like what was your thought process in going into that? And how did you, I mean, I know you saw only opportunity, Senator Lightford and Representative Ammons, because you weren't going to take anything less but the opportunity and the win. But how did you approach that?
So this one was one of those really big spaces that we couldn't get solved in the period of time that we were working with this. Although we worked on the pillars for 8 months total, this was one of those items that was going to take more work. So what we put inside of House Bill 2170 was that we created a study to determine the feasibility of consolidating all workforce development programs under a single agency. What we learned was during our research that there is over 6 agencies that actually receive some support of WIA funding. The state's investment is absolutely zero. All of these are federal dollars, and they're being treated that way. It's been, in many cases, in my opinion, supplemental funds for these different agencies. They're not cohesive. The agencies, they don't speak, their technology doesn't speak to one another. Each agency that is doing some sort of workforce development doesn't even have titled staff in those positions to actually help acquire workforce development. And I think the biggest challenge is that people don't know where to go to get the help. And there are just 2 agencies that have some requirements. There are 2 funding streams that we do receive from the federal government. One that has to go to an education institution. So that one will typically have to stay where it is. But then all of the others, they're just at different agencies for whatever reason. We just don't have an answer. Well, what the governor's administration did based on our feasibility was put together a commission of a really good commission. We just started a week ago, and we're diving in on what particular agency is doing what, who has the capacity, how can we merge and make sure we don't leave any particular area out. How do we best market? How do we get the biggest, bang, if you will? So when we think about high school, you're absolutely correct. in the 80s, and it could have been in the 70s too, but my experience in high school in the 80s, there was welding, mechanics, there was what we call shops, there was food, we called it food, you learn how to cook, there was sewing, there was all these other skills that we were able to take in high school. And then there was workforce programs like DECA and OEA and VICA. I was a part of DECA. So there was other workforce programs that we started our junior year in high school that are missing from many school districts. And so how do we go back to developing that opportunity where you attract kids to a field of interest as early as 16 years old and begin to gear them on a pathway to attaining that certification or making sure they earn that skill set so that they can be in that career setting. I mean, everyone's not going to be the actual doctor or the nurse, but there's a whole lot of positions in the medical field that makes medicine work. You know, everyone's not going to be that doctor, you know, that lawyer, I should say, but there's a whole lot of what goes on at the courthouse. There's a whole lot of positions there. And what we're doing is not exposing our young people to all of these other opportunities. So Rep. Ammons mentioned how we want to make sure that, you know, more Black people are teaching. So we made sure we put a focus on the Minority Teach Illinois Scholarship Program, did a set aside specifically targeted at bringing more Black men into the system. But you also have to think about this in the mental health space. We have to create more social workers and more psychiatrists and because when we talk about trauma in the schools and we talk about trauma on the playground and in the community, there's not even social workers in the school buildings, you know, that we can send the kids to. So even in the mental health space, there's so many more careers that we can look at to inspire young people. So at the end of the day, all of us was taught by a teacher, no matter what profession that we've gone into. And I've always had a great love and passion for teachers and teaching. I'm grateful that I was able to have an impact on policy and in education because I always wanted to teach. But I think that we need to bend back and give our teachers more support and make sure that young Blacks can we reduce the barriers for them getting into the teaching field. So we know there's a teacher shortage, a nursing shortage, you know, there's not enough African Americans in law enforcement. We know all of these things, so we have to build better career paths to getting them there.
Absolutely.
And I'll just pick up where she just left off, because yesterday I'm driving home, I'm in Champaign-Urbana, I drive down the street and I see a Black firefighter working on the truck. I think he's just cleaning the truck, you know, there's no fire, so he's cleaning the truck. And I kind of did a double take. That should not be the case. That we are shocked to see, right? Black people in certain professions where we used to be in those professions prior, now we're not in those professions. And something that I think the national recommendation back in the 60s told us then, and Leader Lightford just mentioned this, that she was part of these programs that were in the schools that helped to introduce you to these careers. And we've taken them effectively out of the schools. We don't have trades in the schools the way we used to. In some schools that focus on ag tech, there's no wonder why there's no Black people functioning in ag tech, or very, very few of them are in ag tech, right? Unless you go down to Tuskegee, where the entire school is focused on, right, ag tech, and the USDA supports that school. But here in Illinois, we are woefully underexposing certainly Black and brown students, but certainly when you look at the numbers, Black students are certainly not being exposed to the multitude of careers that exist at a courthouse. You don't have to be a police officer. You can work with the clerk, you could do different things, but these are spaces that our exposure levels are not there. But we did do some amazing work in this session with the governor's office to put additional dollars into pre-apprenticeship programs. We did that this session. so that there's money to literally train people. $10 million was set aside to expand our Illinois Works pre-apprenticeship programs so that more students can actually get into an apprenticeship program. I'll come back to the apprenticeship thing later with the labor unions, because that's a whole nother issue around workforce development, right? But the reality is we lost the youth corps that used to be in schools that was funded by the state and the federal government. We don't have I used to be a candy striper that I got from my high school, and I volunteered at my hospital when I was in high school so that I could learn about the medical field. A lot of these programs don't exist into the schools any longer. And because they don't exist, we can follow the trajectory of what has happened to student engagement in these different fields, especially if you come from challenged communities with very little resources. I don't know anybody who's an electrician unless I go through a few folk, right? But we used to have electricians in the Black community that could come and fix something if grandmama's stove stopped working. But that doesn't exist because we've taken out all of these programs that build them into the trades and the apprenticeship, or we replaced some of them with just focusing on STEM. Yes, we need STEM education. We absolutely need STEM education. But we also need, right, in the workforce development space, if a student is clearly not interested for whatever reason to going through that 4-year college, we must have available the workforce development programs that they can actually get into without the barriers to entry. And I think that that is what we are looking at, and we're zeroing in on those barriers because we're losing an entire generation to the streets, to gun violence, to prison, and to the grave. And our job is to stop that chain to the streets, to gun violence, to prison, and to the grave. That's our job.
So Tiffany, can I add to that quickly before you say something? Because Representative Ammons has brought up something so critical for me to make sure everybody get this part. One of the things that we recognized earlier on was just the acceptance requirements into University of Illinois, which is one of our flagship schools. The requirements for 2 years of laboratory science, foreign language, some of those subject areas that are just basic requirements for acceptance. We learned earlier on that there are so many school districts, low-income school districts, who do not require the basic requirements to be accepted into our flagship university. So in other words, as a parent, you're sending your child to school, they're doing well, they graduate high school, they apply for these different schools, and you think, oh, well, why isn't my baby being accepted at University of Illinois? They have a 3.5 GPA, their attendance was awesome, it's a good kid. Well, because they were in a school district that didn't require the basic requirements for them to be accepted at our flagship university. We found that out to be a huge problem. And that's where some of the systemic racism lies right there, is that even your kids in Black communities who do well, the school system is not requiring of them to exceed in spaces just for merely being accepted into those university requirements.
Now that's really interesting. I have probably like maybe 2 more comments, and then we want to roll you all into the panel. So I'm hoping that you all can definitely stay for the panel to get engaged in there. One thing, like Senator Lightford, that just under-resourced schools produced unprepared students to even access what's here for them to access, right? And then Rep. Ammons, you brought up the great point about how volunteerism and the volunteerism opportunities that you had in high school actually could lead to a career or an idea of what you want to do in the workforce development space where you just wouldn't have known before. And these same volunteerism opportunities are not being offered, which is, that's like mind-blowing in a way. But just so you know, if you want to know the critical impact of your work, and I'm so sure that the other panelists are going to discuss this. I had a meeting earlier with some South Suburban superintendent that has a group that actually wants to start up and set up a regional voc ed facility based off of the things that you all embedded in pillar 2. So, you know, as somebody at the table said, that's taking the policy and making the policy a promise. And so that is what is so exciting about the work that you all have done. So as we close up and move to the panel, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the impact of COVID-19 on the pandemic on the education system and this critical work that you all were doing and further exposing the marginalization of Black youth in terms of education and Black access into the workforce field. So as you kind of wrap up your final words, can you bring into the thoughts and the impact of how COVID impacted all of these things? And then we'll move right into the panel with Ryan and I think Sophia loading up the slides after these final statements.
So in closing for me, I would say that, you know, COVID has been devastating on, I would say all of us. I don't know anyone that hasn't been impacted in some way or another by this killer virus. But what it did for me, and I think for our state and this community, was that at a moment in time, we were all forced to stay at home. We were all obligated to be still and sit into a space and learn from one another when we're all so busy moving and shaking and trying to make things happen and no one's clearly listening to each other. I mean, we hear each other, but it's not translating into ridding systemic racism. COVID made us sit still. And when we sat still, it pulled the scab off of all of the healthcare inequities that we've been describing that you would find in our healthcare and human services pillar 4. There was a reason why more Blacks were dying of COVID. There was a reason why there was a disproportionately impacted number of Black Americans affected by COVID, because they were unhealthy, because there was issues around high blood pressure, high cholesterol, or you know, high sugar, as we call it, you know, because of food deserts and some of those other social detriments of health that we bring up in our pillar 3 of equity, access, and opportunity. So when Carol mentioned earlier how all of our pillars intertwine with each other, they do. From the time we're born into life itself, these inequities greet us. These inequities exist and they roll over, and they're in the criminal justice system. They're in the health education system. They're in the healthcare system. They're in the fact that we can't go to a bank and get a loan. They're in the fact that there's food deserts in our communities, and there's no, you know, since Martin Luther King was murdered in 1968, but Madison and Pulaski looked the same since 1968, but all this other development in the city of Chicago has taken shape. There is redlining that is obvious in our communities. And so what COVID did for me was it helped to expose at one single time all of these inequities, where now everyone's saying there ought to be more inclusion. There ought to be, you know, inclusion is the new word, equity is the new word. But I want to make sure we actually feel it, we mean it, and we're trying to make some corrective changes with it. Not just the Black Caucus, not just the Black legislators, but all of us. I think that you learn from young people. If any of you have conversations with young people, you will learn that they want to rid racism. They want to work together. They want to learn about each other's cultures. That's why our Inclusive American History Commission is so important, because we have to stop teaching untruth to young people, and they grow up with that belief and thinking that they're superior over other people because of their experience, when life hasn't been fair from the time that you were born. A large percentage of people just don't have the same opportunities and access. So I just want to thank you for, and this whole series in UIS, and me being a graduate of UIS with my master's degree in public administration, had no idea how I would use it. First in my family to earn a degree, I just knew that I needed it. And I just knew that I would be the first, and that I had a responsibility to pass that down to my nieces and nephews and the rest of my family. And when you know better, you do better. So I just want to thank you for educating the community and allowing us to share more of the pillars. And I'm looking forward to the panels and as experts, what they found the bill to be. And I hope they can give us some suggestions and some encouragement around what we can continue to do to make life better. The whole goal is just to move a person from preschool through higher education or workforce development with the same opportunities as all kids. We want quality education for our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader. So well said. Just want to put a couple of points on that. Leader Lightford just really articulated several of the points that COVID did. COVID unmasked for those who did not have the same experiences as Black communities and Brown communities have every day. So the brother on the corner can tell me exactly what's wrong in the Black community, but others may not experience it, and therefore people may not hear from him because he can't articulate through data and statistics the actual problem, but he's been saying it all along. And so COVID really took back that onion of the disparities in every single part of civil society, and we call it civil. But the experiences in the Black community ain't very civil. And so the violence that we are experiencing, no community wants to experience the level of violence that we are all literally at this moment experiencing, because we have young people. I literally get off of my call before Tiffany called me. Thank you, Tiffany.
You're welcome.
Today, with 14 juveniles in our juvenile detention center tonight, 11 of them for gun-related incidents, and all of them under the age of 14. That tells us a lot about what has happened and what COVID reveals. COVID revealed the disparities. COVID revealed for sure the disregard of the Black community, whether it was our health, the exploitation of our economics, and each pillar tells you what they were, the disparity in access to higher education and pre-K and everything between. When you send children home with no school, that's tantamount to what, I have to say it this way, so I apologize if anyone is offended, but what white racist segregationists did at the result of 1954's Brown versus Board education. They closed the schools for 5 years so that Black students could not go to school in response to the Supreme Court ruling in Brown. So that's not slavery. That's 1954. That's my mother's time. So we have built all of our institutions on the hysteria of color. And we need to get that out of our systems and respond adequately to the lack of resources, access, and opportunities for all people in our society. If we truly, truly want to have a democratic society, that democratic society doesn't exist if you disenfranchise a majority of the society. And so we saw that as a result of COVID, and we've tried to respond to that. It is necessary for us to always ask the question, what happened? Why did it happen? And what can be done to prevent it from happening again and again in our democratic society? I think that that's what our task is as educators on this call and leaders in your community. That is also your task. Whether you're a Black person, brown person, white person, we need to answer the question that Brown versus Board still has not solved to this date. And that's our charge. So thank you so much, Tiffany, for all of your work. Thank you, UIS, for even doing this series. This is so important and monumental. I think it's going to certainly excite our members to continue to do the work that we're doing.
Well, first of all, you hysteria color. I'm gonna coin that phrase. I mean, that's about to be my new workforce development thing right there. I'm about to put it on t-shirts.
I saw you hop up and write it down. Like, let me get this.
I got my little notebook right here. But no, seriously, thank you all both. You all know that I enjoy working with you all so much, both of you all. And since this is about education, you all have educated me so much personally. So whether or not you all say I'm a teacher or not, you both are, because you all have taught me so much. And I'm grateful to continue to build this relationship and continue to be able to work with you all in this capacity and in this space. I'm just so grateful. You all are champions. You all are sheroes. You all are wonderful women that look fabulous and rock it every day to make this space of Illinois better for Black folks in general, better for people, and better for all the communities throughout the state. And I just thank you so much for your leadership. And with that, I'm glad that you all will be staying for the panel. And I'm going to throw this over to Ryan and Sophia. And if all of the panelists now, thank you so much.
Good evening. Thank you so much. And thank you, Senator Lightford and Representative Ammons, for your service, for your commitment to education reform, and just the discussion. I learned so much. I also want to thank everyone for the opportunity to moderate this panel. I do want to quickly just introduce our panelists again. So we have Dr. Sophia Gelhausen with us with the Illinois Board of Higher Education. We have Dr. Tiffany Brunson with the Rockford Public School District 205. We have Dr. Betsy Goulet, UIS, Public Administration Clinical Assistant Professor. Dr. Nicole Nash Moody, she is with the Springfield Public School District 186. Omowale Cassell with Discovery Partners Institute. Ken Walker with Per Scholas, and Stacy Davis Gates with the Chicago Teachers Union. She is the political director. So I just want to jump in. The first question is really for all of our panelists. Can we speak to the intentions of Pillar 2 and why Pillar 2 and why is Pillar 2 imperative to educational and workforce development advancements today?
I can start. I mean, I think that as we've heard over the last bit from the fireside chat, that there has to be an intentionality in anything that we do. So when we think about how do we change the impacts and how do we change the outcomes for Black students and Black persons that are residents of the city of Chicago, state of Illinois, we really have to think about like where things have gone wrong. We have to think about where there are gaps that need to be solved for. And I think that having something, a legislative agenda and things that get passed that start to influence and impact that are always helpful. And I think that the first stage is passing things. And I think that the real next thing is like, well, what do you do with that? You know, what sort of framework do you need to create so that you start to get to outcomes, right? You know, the big wins are going to be when we start seeing changes on the south and the west side of Chicago. It's going to be when we start seeing people employed in real jobs. I mean, when you think about the technology industry, it's been the greatest creation of wealth in almost human history. And we don't have enough people that are persons of color that are participating in that. And so I think that like we're on a journey and we're on a path. And I think that the real next step has to be, how do we start enrolling Black and brown students in programs that are really intentionally designed to be trending on the jobs of the future, the jobs that are going to get them into software development, cybersecurity, and data science. I think that that's what we have to intentionally think about. And also it has to be like a rethinking of education, right? I think we often think about education in a traditional manner that you go from high school to a career, whereas really education needs to be like, how do you get the skills to go and do a job, do it well, and get paid in response to that? Not necessarily that you go to a four-year college, you get a diploma and you're branded in such a way. We need to get people skills quickly so that they can get into these jobs. We have thousands and thousands of unfilled technology roles in the city of Chicago and state of Illinois, and we have higher than ever unemployment rates for Black and brown people. And so it's like, when you see that gap, it's like, how do we move people in that direction? I think that that's really what we need to speak to. And I think that that's what Pillar 2 starts to set in motion.
Okay, thank you.
I'll go next. Looking at it from the educational realm, what I'm excited about with Pillar 2, all the pillars, but Pillar 2 in particular, is that recognizing that systemic problems need systemic solutions. And I'm excited because this right here is going to put, as we say, put a little meat on the bones, because really it isn't just about removing barriers. When we're talking about education, we're also talking about building bridges. And I really see this as being something tangible as from a policy standpoint that we can then implement in schools. Unfortunately, it takes the heart and the head. And I believe that the heart is there, but now the head has to catch up. So now, because there are policies that schools now see, these are things that need to be done. And then now we are able to say, there's funding, we can do this, but it also starts to everyone's point that we've talked about, it starts super early. It starts in pre-K. It starts in early childhood. We can't wait to try to give our students the skills that they need, those soft skills, as well as the academic skills that they'll need once they get into high school and then on to a pathway after that. But it really does start at the youngest ages and giving our kids access and opportunity for all of these great opportunities that they can have, and not just one pathway. Because I think that that's one of the things that has happened, is that there has become like one pathway. Either you go to college or what do you do? And I am really quickly, I went to Chicago Vocational High School. And so I was one of those kids that completely knew what it was like to have all of these different opportunities, even though my path took me down to education, go to the University of Illinois and to get a PhD and become, an educator. But I still had all these other opportunities because they were there for me. And so I really do think that what I'm excited about is that the understanding of systemic problems deserve and require systemic solutions. And I think we have some great solutions right here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And can I connect with something that Dr. Brunson said about the early intervention? I think that the Pillar 2 has such incredible potential to be this catalyst for such remarkable change, where we are recognizing what's already happening to kids in preschool. And we know that these are children who are coming into the preschool class, into kindergarten, and they already have baggage and burden of so much trauma. And if we aren't educating the educators to know what that looks like, they misdiagnose it as, behavior that's defiant, instead of children who are dysregulated, who cannot even focus in their classroom. And there was an amazing study done of 6,000 preschool parents of preschool students, and they knew that those children, for every adverse childhood experience that those kids experience themselves, by 80% higher risk of suspensions and expulsions in preschool. So if we know that's what's happening for the very youngest of our students, they carry that through into elementary school and further. So the key is saying those things that are uncomfortable, talking about adverse childhood experiences, recognizing implicit bias and the role it plays in that misdiagnosis of children who are anxious and scared and sad, and on the far end of the continuum, depressed. And we have to not only make the recognition, but find the resources. So once we train the teachers to know what they're looking at, we give them the skills and the tools and the resources in the communities to solve the problem for the kids.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Goulet.
I can just piggyback on that. I think that, I don't need to say a whole lot, because I really just would echo what many of my colleagues have said, but I really appreciate about Pillar 2 the fact that it takes into account the full spectrum of from preschool through higher ed, and really recognizes that, in a few minutes, we'll look at some of these disparities that we always look at this disparities when it gets to, college completion. But really, the disparities start so much earlier, and they're so important. And the fact that this pillar, for example, codifies the kindergarten readiness assessment and really identifies, through some of the resources that Dr. Goulet was mentioning about identifying, children who are victims of trauma, and really thinking about, and addressing those problems from the very beginning, so that these children will have a fighting chance. Because it doesn't matter if you want to become a firefighter or a college professor or an electrician, you need to learn how to read and write. And if you are already so burdened by trauma and systemic bias, systemic racism in your elementary classroom, and even in your your kindergarten classroom, your nursery, then we see that for example, reading levels, even in 3rd and 4th grade, there are huge disparities in reading levels that then carry on in children's ability to learn through the rest of their educational careers. And so I just really appreciate the holistic nature of this bill, and how it addresses so many different aspects of systemic racism in our education system. So thank you. With that, I'll yield to my colleagues.
Actually, Dr. Gilhausen, did you want to speak to the Early Childhood Access Consortium for Equity, since we're talking about really starting from the ground up as we think about reform?
I would love to talk about the Early Childhood Access Consortium for Equity. So as part of this education omnibus bill, as maybe some of you know, or probably a lot of you, the Board of Higher Education, along with the Community College Board and other stakeholders, we did a strategic planning process from the beginning of this year for the next to guide higher education in the state of Illinois for the next decade. And we were tasked by this omnibus bill to take a look specifically at the early education incumbent workforce, and what were the barriers to upskilling the early education incumbent workforce, because we know, as we've just been discussing, how important it is to have stable education, quality teachers, quality education. And there is a movement, to require educator licensure and higher levels of education in the early childhood workforce. So we worked through our work group in our strategic planning process to look at those barriers and figure out how could we design sort of a brand new and innovative way of addressing them. And what we came up with was the Early Childhood Access Consortium for Equity. And as I think, I know that Leader Lightford and Representative Ammons know that it passed unanimously in the House and the Senate, which was just really unprecedented. And so the idea behind the consortium is to bring together higher education institutions, community colleges, public universities, and all public institutions are members by statute, but private institutions, not-for-profit institutions can join the consortium. And so the community colleges and universities will work together to facilitate transfer, to offer coursework, and at regional hubs, and through cohort models, and through ways that are more accessible to working mothers. Most of the incumbent early childhood workforce is made up of women of color who are barely making a living wage. They probably, you know, have their own children that they're caring for while they're working for a very low wage. And so this consortium is also going to, with the help of federal funds, pay for full cost of attendance to complete an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree or a community college certificate, Gateway's credentials. So essentially, whichever level the individual is starting at, they can move up to the next level. The federal funding for scholarships is going to last for 3 years. So we'll see, you know, what we can do to continue it after that. But the idea is to make coursework more accessible. It also mandates the acceptance of the Associate of Applied Science in early childhood education with junior level status. That was identified as one of the major barriers. Students that were graduating with an AAS were not eligible for transfer into four-year institutions. They were being required to take all sorts of classes over again. And, you know, again, ending up costing way too much, taking too much time, and just really putting up a wall that said, this isn't for me, I can't do this. And so we're trying to get at all of those different barriers through this consortium to make that education accessible with wraparound services, coaches and mentors at the institutions, navigators located throughout the state to help with connections to those community childcare centers to get the word out, help people apply to school, help people to identify a program that's right for them. So we're trying to really just make it accessible, make it affordable, and so that people, that members of the incumbent workforce that want to get to that next level of education can do it without facing those barriers, or at least with the tools that can help them get through the barriers and over the barriers.
Thank you very much for expanding on that. And I think it really touches on what Dr. Brunson said earlier about systemic solutions, being the approach to systemic problems. So I actually want to move into the social and racial disparities that persist in education. Can we speak to those? Yes,
I'm
ma'am.
sorry, I was using a little raise your hand function, but I just wanted to ask that Dr. Gelhausen include in a consortium, and this is maybe something we need to do as a General Assembly. One of the childcare workers, actually, she ran her own facility down in Tuscola, Illinois, and she literally had to close it because the licensing piece, I hope you guys take up, is a humongous barrier. And the woman who happened to be an African-American woman in Tuscola, which is not an African-American community, was providing services in that community, but she, who had a bachelor's degree in business administration, could not be an instructor of her own facility because she didn't have a particular early childhood degree. That is also a barrier because she ran that facility with her business degree, and all of her work has been in early childhood, but she didn't want to go back to school to get a specific early childhood degree to qualify her for licensing with the Department of Children and Family Services. So the consortium should look at the licensing piece as well. And then lastly, another owner in Champaign said to me that, yes, thank you, Governor, for putting the money in to help pay for the educational piece, but when you come out of school, the positions don't pay enough for me to go back through school. So I just wanted to give you that for the consortium to take up those two issues as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So can we look at or talk about the social and racial disparities that, still persist in education, and how the reform will address improvements, as well as what the intended outcomes are. And so if we can get an education perspective, as well as a workforce development perspective.
I would like to go, and this is Stacy, and apologies for my camera. What I will say about that is that I think this is the beauty of what we are experiencing currently with all of the pillars. You can't speak about any one pillar in isolation. And I think that that was the point, and that was the best intent possible. Because what we know is that within our classrooms, within our school communities, we're a microcosm of the larger community, of the larger spaces that we reside in. That being said, it's just very important for us to talk about how do we address these disparities through the entire family. If you have a student in your classroom, they're not there 24/7. They actually are in community with an entire neighborhood, as well as they live with the family. So when we are intentional about saying that moms and dads need jobs, so it's good to hear the Early Childhood Consortium say that we are going to reach out to parents and make sure that they have an opportunity in the same way that we want their children to have an opportunity. When we talk about systemic change, we're talking about systemic change through families. Children do not exist on islands by themselves, right? So let's connect it to the criminal justice pillar. We know that our Black children have parents who are incarcerated. So when we decriminalize things, when we deal effectively with mandatory sentences, when we deal effectively with policing practices that disproportionately target Black communities, we are also dealing with making the family whole. We are also dealing with making the community whole. We're also dealing with making the school communities whole that the children attend. That is what's so, I think, uberly important about all of the pillars combined, is that you will see a thoroughness in how it impacts children, how it impacts families. So I just want to keep our focus. Yes, children, they need us. And they come from mothers, and they come from fathers and grandmothers and aunts and uncles. And if we learned nothing through COVID, is that when families were able to deal effectively with the transition from the building to virtual, it's because there was a community of people willing to pitch in.
Well, and from that perspective, I'll add and say that our work as educators has always been, but particularly now, is relationships. And that's the word that comes to my mind when I hear you speak, is that in the work that we do, of course, you think education and you think career, college readiness, that's what we're about. But even before that, it's about the relationship piece. And we talked about the time of COVID, where many of us were isolated by ourselves or with families, and got a chance to learn ourselves more. And so now that we're back together with one another, we're learning our students as well as our staff and what they need, and those needs are large. So I appreciate the pillars, and that it gives us backbone, gives us law stand on, to lean upon, to put those policies and practices in place. Teacher principals are rule followers. So when you have something in place that says this is the direction, this is the vision, none of those pillars, none of the components of those you can argue with. However, some of them are challenging because it's change. And so with that, the seed and the start of it is the relationship piece, having the policy and changing our practices around that. These pillars provide that support for us. But it's one thing I know for sure is it's personal work first. Over these last couple of years, I've learned that for sure. The professional work, the personal work first, starting with the relationship and social political piece.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Speaking of that, Dr. Goulet, did you want to speak to the work that you and Dr. Moody, as well as Dr. Brunson, are doing as far as working with ISB and dealing with suspensions and expulsions?
Thank you, Ryan. Yes, and I'm just so excited not only to be a part of this conversation, but to recognize that, you know, some of the folks that are here tonight, the professionals that are passionate about this work, have come together to look at the disproportionality of these suspensions and expulsions that we're talking about, and the impact that that moment in a child's life has on their trajectory, even, you know, from, as we said, preschool all the way through to the workforce. So it's been a wonderful partnership that's growing between ISB and UIS and some school districts that have, in a really awful, horrible time to take on anything else, have stepped up and said, we want to be a part of this. So we're bringing a couple layers of skills and services to the school districts. One that I want to just really highlight is called empathic instruction. And it's coming to us from Berkeley. It's evidence-based, and it is a training for teachers to understand empathy in the classroom, to have a different lens through which to view children's behavior. And what's the most exciting to bring this to Illinois is that the previous use of this technique has reduced suspensions and expulsions by 50%. And if we can even come halfway up to that level, if we can keep at it and go from this year as a pilot to next year with additional school districts, we'll just be so excited to sit back and look at those results and say, what next? What else can we do? Where else can we make change? So I just want to thank Dr. Moody and Dr. Brunson for being a part of that experience. And we just look forward to talking to you next year about what this year brings.
Thank you.
And really, we appreciated the opportunity to be a part of that work, and knowing that our data, particularly around our African-American males in discipline, has looked the same for decades with an S++. And so we know that we have to do things differently, but as I hear that and say that, we talk about practice and the professional side of it, like the doing part, but I would propose that we need to be differently. That's the relationship piece that I was speaking about, that we have to learn each other. We have to understand our students. We have to understand their experiences that they bring to us in different ways that they act that may not be the social political norm. Doesn't mean it's misbehavior. And so we are really on a journey with that, particularly in our city, but I know it's a national one as well, that we really have to disrupt our mindset, our stereotypes, that our system is I don't even know the word. It's just a part of our system. And as you talked about before, that this is systemic. And to be honest, and I've had to do personal reflection on that I was a part of the system and have fed the system, have been successful in the system. So I have to look inside of myself and say, the change in me, who will I become, or who will I be to help influence the system so that it can change? And so it's very hard to change the system without changing people. So a lot of our work, particularly with our staff, is supporting them and supporting their journey with understanding who they are, who our children are, in order to change the way in which we interact with them. And again, honor who they are, the children, that the beautiful being that they are, and not be caught up in stereotypical mindset we have about behaviors that they present, which really are not even fair and not truly who they are. So we appreciate having the invitation to be a part of that and learn along the way. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Mr. Walker, would you like to jump in and speak to disparities, speak to systemic solutions to systemic problems?
Sure. So thank you. So Perscolas, a technology training program, 85% of the folks who come through our doors are diverse. And so I say that specifically, Amawali, you had mentioned all of these digital and technical jobs that are available in Illinois and throughout the nation. And employers are telling us that they can't find Black and Brown talent, but they exist. And we know they exist because we have proven results. 80% of the folks who go through our training programs, get certifications, we find them jobs. So having conversations in high school and in elementary school suggesting that there are other ways in which to earn a thriving wage in a technology field is incredibly important. In the schools, finding out, who are the students, who are the learners who are excited about tech. They like to tinker. They fix grandma's computer. Target those folks and share with them that there are alternative ways to get into technology. And oh my God, you get into technology and you start at $50,000, maybe. You can quickly earn six figures, and you have changed the trajectory of your family. You've changed the trajectory. You've brought economic development to your community, and that's real impact. And so we've seen that impact across 17 campuses. Accelerate Chicago was just announced, where we have an ecosystem of organizations just like ours, Year Up, Empower, et cetera. And I love ecosystems, right? Because this to me represents a ton of opportunities for young folks or folks who want to just upskill to say, hey, I want to get in the technology industry, and here's an opportunity. And they don't have to spend all of those dollars on college necessarily. Our program is free, right? So from a workforce development opportunity, Pillar 2, I'm incredibly excited because that means more pipeline, right? You guys are talking to them in high school and telling them about this wonderful opportunity to go to a training program. That's what we need. I want more butts and seats at Priscolas.
Thank you.
Add on to that point from Ken. I think that, oftentimes we talk about like gaps and we talk about, sort of like deficit, but I think that like what Ken is really getting at is that like, when we don't have people from Black and brown communities in technology, we're actually hurting the entire city. We're hurting the entire state because we miss out on innovation. We miss out on new inventions. We miss out on new opportunities. And so like Chicago, greater Chicago area is a majority minority city, yet only 26% of people in the technology industry are Black or brown. So you have this entire gap, and most of us tend to be toward the entry level. My background is engineering. I've run engineering teams, I've run product teams, like I've hosted things, and I've never saw another Black or brown person that's been in the room with me or that's reported to me. And so when I sort of think about like the trajectory or what we need to do is like, if we don't get more people in and we don't get like these new inventions and innovations, like we're hurting our entire city. So like, even if people don't want Black or brown people in, like you're basically saying that you don't want Chicago to be great, because Chicago can only be great if you get more people from these communities in, because there are all sorts of ideas. Like we have these hidden gems on the South and the West side that if you give them the right training and you give them the right skills, they're going to do fantastic. Like we created this sort of like mythology that technology is hard to learn or that it's difficult to understand, and it's just not true. You can learn this just the same way you can learn anything else. And so like, I think that the disparity sort of like bothers me, not from the deficit, but like what inventions are we missing out on? Like what could we have invented in Chicago if we intentionally focus on getting more Black and brown kids and adults into this technology industry?
Thank you, which actually brings me to one of our questions. Back to Pillar 2, how does it create equity and opportunity for workforce development and preparing our next generation?
I could say that I just sort of think about like they had the thing when people were growing up. I was a tinkerer as a kid. I used to mess around with remote control cars. I used to take apart VCRs and camcorders and things like that. And so I think that as you start to see yourself as something, as you start to see an engineer, or as you start to see a software developer, right? So like if we focus on a generation now and try to get people from a workforce development into tech careers quickly, then you have a whole generation that's in elementary school, middle and high school that's going to start to see those engineers. And it's not going to be so scary. It's not going to be so intimidating because you see people actually doing the work. You see people as CTOs, you see people as heads of product. And I think that the more visible that you can make that, it makes it real. It makes it like, because like for me, it's like, I didn't know if I could do it. Like I never seen anybody that looked like me doing this. And so it's like, you had to take a leap of faith. We shouldn't in 2030 still have Black and brown kids taking leaps of faith, because we need to get people into these industries so they can see a CTO at Groupon, or a CTO at Echo Global Logistics, or a CTO at ShipBob that looks like a Black or brown person that is a majority in this city. And so I think that that's the imperative that we have to get to. That's how we get to more equity. It's like, we can put all these programs and policies in place, but like when people don't see it, like our communities function on trust, and like people telling them that it's okay, and that like you can go into this and you can do this, sweetheart, you can do this, young man, you can do this, kings and queens, you can do this. And I think that like the closer that we get to that, like that's how we're going to start to progress things. And I think that like that's why it's so important that we start to get people into the technology industry quickly. And we know how to do it. We know that, you know, through organizations like KIN, or through an organization like DPI, that like you can get someone from zero to tech in 1 year or less. So like, let's start doing that. Let's start enrolling people in there so that we can create like better outcomes for the current folks, so they can have better incomes and better career opportunities. But also we got a whole generation coming after them that are looking for like, is this okay? Can I do this?
Mm-hmm. You know, there's actually a question from the audience that I want to ask. It says, how can we have technology and engineering jobs when there are policies in place that are hindering or discouraging companies from being here? I worked in Chicagoland in engineering, but the taxes and legislative policies deter businesses from being here. So can you address that? Or anyone for that matter?
I'm happy to. I'm still on the call.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Surely, taxes is one of those things people like really hate to talk about. But the reality is, in the state of Illinois, we may have different taxes at different levels comparative to other states, and they may have some tax structures that we don't have in Illinois. I don't believe it's the tax structure that's problematic. I believe that there is a fundamental problem that I think Mr. Walker and Mr. Cassell just spoke to. We have a whole group of people and multiple generations of people that we've kind of left out of the system. So there's a real drawdown on social service programming for communities that we need to help and uphold, because we don't pay a living wage. We don't make sure that young people are getting through to technology and to training in those areas. We don't see talent. My grandson came to me and said, he's just started back to school. He's in 5th grade. He said, BB, he calls me BB. He said, I need to be in another classroom, he said. He said, it's too easy for me. He said, I want to go to the advanced class. I said, have you talked to your teacher about it? He said, yes, but they didn't do anything. I said, okay, let me talk to your mom. We will intervene. And we did. And not only did we put him into the advanced class, but he's doing well there too, because he tinkers, he likes mechanics, but nobody saw anything in him, because he said to me, if I stay in this class, I'm going to get in trouble. That's what he said. Mm-hmm. And he understood that, and he identified that at 5th grade. So is taxes the real issue? No, Chicago is one of the biggest hubs for import, export, transportation in the world. And we are the 3rd largest city in the United States that have all kinds of opportunities, but some communities are left out of that. So for those folks who believe that taxes is their reason not to be in Illinois, I think there's a lot of other reasons to be in Illinois, and tech innovation is one of them. And so I hope that we will take what we learned tonight. This has been edification for me as well, that we will utilize this to provide more opportunities for expansion. And I think what Mr. Cassell said with DPI is that we are losing whole generations of ideas by locking people out that could lower our tax brackets if we weren't supporting people in all of these other areas, because they don't have enough resources to live and maintain their families, and maybe one day take their children to Disneyland. I think we have some work to do in that area, and hopefully we can lower property taxes. I would love mine lower, but until that point, we should make space for folks to build up our industries and to bring more revenue into families so that we can then share the wealth, if you will, around the tax structure.
Mhm. Thank you, Representative Ammons. So we
I would
are,
like-
go ahead.
Can
Yes.
I add to that? I think one of the things that I think is really grounding this, and I love that you said the word edification. I think it's really important for us to see and understand that this is deeply human work. Even though we're talking about taxes, or we're talking about the workforce, we're talking about human beings, and not divesting, but investing in them, seeing them, understanding them, seeing all of our, especially our Black and Brown children, they're at them as assets. What do they bring, as opposed to looking at them through a deficit lens? Because that's what happens. And we see that when we start looking at them through a deficit lens from pre-K, from early childhood, there are great implications for us as a state, and even as a nation, as to what we, with innovation and what these young people can bring to us. They're going to be the ones that are going to, if we do not invest in them in the right ways, then we will, as a country, lose out on what they could bring us. But because we don't see them as assets or what they can bring, then we end up losing out so much. It isn't just about the one kid, it's about all the kids, and then what that means for us as a nation. And I always like to think of it in its, holistically, because it really is, we start losing generations, which we have lost so many, but it also is about how far should we be when it comes to equity and justice and fairness and liberation? How far are we from all of that to where we should be as a nation? And if we don't really, really invest in our children, especially our Black and Brown children, I'm hopeful, but I'm also pragmatic in knowing that if we don't do it, now we have policies which are fantastic in Pillar 1. We have kind of something that's telling us these are the things that we can do, and they would have a great impact on our cities, in our nation. We just really have to do the work. And so, but we have to see it as deeply human work, and that we're talking about human beings, because we have to invest in our young people.
Well, thank you everyone for all your wisdom this evening and conversation. Ryan, a special thanks to you for moderating the panel. Senator Lightford and Representative Ammons for being with us tonight. We can't thank you enough. And Tiffany, for the strong partnership that we have going here with UIS, between your Caucus Foundation and UIS. We're just thrilled with the kind attention of all our audience members and those that are going forward too, that'll listen to our recording. So we UIS will work with Tiffany this week, and we will have the recording and the save the date for our next our 4th virtual series that we'll have in December on Pillar 3. And I just want to say thank you so much again. And Tiffany, I'll let you close it out.
Well, thank you so much, Molly. Once again, everybody, you all are absolutely phenomenal. When I heard Chicago needs to be great, Illinois needs to be great, that's exactly what we're working for. And we understand that greatness is pivotally entrenched in education. I tell kids all the time, especially Black youth, your ancestors created arithmetic. Your ancestors created physics. Your ancestors created all of these innovations through their tinkering, such as the stoplight, such as the plasma system. Like, all of these things came from Black folks. It is encrypted in your DNA. So young kings and queens, you can do anything that you want to do, whether it's going to a 4-year institution, whether it's being in the tech world, whether it's being a mechanic, whatever it is you want to do, because that type of ability is you. And all you have to do is sit at the table and be educated on it. And it's our job to create that pathway to it. So thank you tonight, everyone. Senator Kimberly A. Lightford, Representative Carol Ammons, you know how I feel about you all. Thank you so much for joining us, and all of the speakers. Together, we can do all of this. So let's keep pushing forward. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all. Good night.